On August 5th, 1962, at approximately 3:30 in the morning, a housekeeper named Eunice Murray noticed a light still on under Marilyn Monroe's bedroom door. She knocked. No answer. She called out. Silence. She went outside and looked through the window, and there, lying on the bed, phone in hand, was Marilyn Monroe. Dead at 36 years old. Within hours, the news had spread around the world. Radio stations interrupted programming. Newspapers scrambled to print extra editions. Crowds gathered outside her home in Brentwood. And in that moment, something shifted. Marilyn Monroe, the person, ceased to exist, and Marilyn Monroe, the icon, was born. In the decades since her death, Marilyn has become more famous than she ever was in life. Her image has been reproduced millions of times. Her face has sold everything from perfume to poetry. Her story has been told and retold in books, films, documentaries, musicals. She has become a symbol, a myth, a product. And in the process, the woman who actually lived and died has been buried beneath layers of interpretation, commodification, and cultural projection. This isn't a story about how Marilyn Monroe died. It's a story about what happened after, about how a woman's tragedy became the world's obsession, about how pain became profit, about how we took a life and turned it into an industry. The first thing that happened after Marilyn's death was the scramble to control the narrative. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled her death a probable suicide caused by acute barbiturate poisoning. But almost immediately questions emerged. The timeline didn't add up. There were inconsistencies in witness statements. Details that didn't make sense. Some believed it was an accidental overdose. Marilyn had a well-documented history of relying on pills to sleep, and it was possible she had simply miscalculated. Others pointed to negligence by her doctors, who had been prescribing her dangerous combinations of medications for years. And then there were the conspiracy theories. Involvement by the Kennedy family. Murder disguised as suicide. Cover-ups by powerful people who wanted her silenced. The truth is, we'll never know for certain what happened that night. The investigation was incomplete. Evidence was mishandled. Key witnesses gave conflicting accounts. But what's significant isn't just the mystery itself. It's the way that mystery became part of Marilyn's brand. Because in death, Marilyn Monroe became more interesting than she had been in life. She became a puzzle to solve, a tragedy to consume, a story that could be reshaped and retold endlessly, each version revealing more about the storyteller than about Marilyn herself. Within days of her death, the media had already begun constructing the narrative that would define her legacy. She was the tragic blonde, the doomed starlet, the woman who had everything and nothing. Headlines focused on her failed marriages, her struggles with mental health, her alleged affairs, her loneliness. The complexity of her life was flattened into a morality tale about fame and its dangers. Her funeral, held on August 8, 1962 at Westchester Village Memorial Park. Cemetery was a small, private affair. Joe DiMaggio, her second husband, took control of the arrangements. He banned Hollywood from attending. No studio executives, no directors, no actors. He wanted it to be dignified. He wanted it to be about the person, not the persona. But even that act of protection became part of the mythology. DiMaggio's devotion to Marilyn, his refusal to move on, his decades of sending roses to her grave. All of it fed into the narrative. Marilyn Monroe was the woman men couldn't save, the woman they loved but lost, the eternal muse, the perfect tragedy. And that's when the commodification really began. In the months and years following her death, Marilyn's image became more valuable than ever. Photographers sold outtakes from old shoots. Magazines published retrospectives. Studios re-released her films. The woman who had fought so hard to be taken seriously as an actress, who had studied method acting and tried to break free from typecasting, was now remembered primarily for her looks, her marriages, and her death. By the mid-1960s, Andy Warhol had turned her into pop art. His silk-screened portraits of Marilyn, with their bright artificial colors and repeated images, became iconic in their own right. Warhol saw her as the ultimate symbol of American celebrity culture, a mass-produced image, a product, and his art reflected that. But in doing so, he also cemented the idea that Marilyn was no longer a person. She was a brand. The 1970s brought a wave of biographies. Some were sympathetic, others were sensationalist. Norman Mailer's 1973 book, Marilyn, a Biography, was one of the most controversial. Mailer had never met Marilyn. He based his book largely on secondary sources and his own interpretations. He speculated about her relationships, her mental state, her motivations, and much of what he wrote was later disputed or debunked. But the book was a bestseller because people didn't want facts. They wanted a story. In the 1980s and 1990s, conspiracy theories about her death gained traction. Books and documentaries alleged cover-ups, mob involvement, government conspiracies. Some claimed she had been murdered because she knew too much about the Kennedys. Others suggested she had been silenced to protect powerful men. None of these theories were ever proven, but they didn't need to be. They added to the mythology. They kept Marilyn relevant. They kept her marketable. By the 2000s, Marilyn Monroe had been dead for 40 years. And yet, her image was more ubiquitous than ever. Her likeness appeared on T-shirts, posters, coffee mugs, phone cases. Her estate, now managed by a company called Authentic Brands Group, licensed her image to hundreds of products. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a historical figure, she was intellectual property. In 2011, a cosmetics company launched a Marilyn Monroe makeup line. In 2012, her white subway dress from the 7-Year Itch sold at auction for over $4 million. In 2022, Kim Kardashian wore the actual dress Marilyn had worn to sing Happy Birthday to President Kennedy, sparking outrage and debate. The dress was delicate, historical, irreplaceable, and it was used as a publicity stunt. This is what Marilyn Monroe has become, a symbol so detached from the reality of her life that she can be anything we want her to be. Feminist icon, victim of patriarchy, sex symbol, tragic figure, empowered woman, cautionary tale. The real Marilyn, the one who struggled with insecurity and addiction and loneliness, is lost beneath the weight of all these projections. And here's the uncomfortable truth, and we like it that way, because if Marilyn is a symbol, we don't have to think about her as a person. We don't have to confront the ways that Hollywood exploited her, the ways that the public consumed her, the ways that we, collectively, failed her. It's easier to buy a Marilyn Monroe poster than to ask why she died alone at 36. It's easier to quote her famous lines than to read her journals and see the pain beneath the performance. It's easier to turn her into an icon than to acknowledge that she was a human being who suffered. But let's be clear about what that suffering looked like. Marilyn Monroe spent her entire adult life being objectified. She was hired for her looks. She was typecast as the dumb blonde. She was paid less than her male co-stars despite being the bigger draw. She was late to set because she had crippling anxiety. She forgot her lines because she was on medications that impaired her cognition. She struggled because she was a person in crisis, and no one around her knew how to help. The studios didn't care. They saw her as a product. When she was difficult, they replaced her. When she asked for more money or better roles, they dismissed her. When she tried to take control of her own career by starting her own production company, they undermined her at every turn. The press didn't help. They printed rumors. They speculated about her relationships. They mocked her ambitions. When she married Arthur Miller and tried to be taken seriously as an intellectual, they called her pretentious. When she struggled with her mental health, they called her unstable. And the public, for all their adoration, saw her as entertainment. They didn't see her as someone who needed compassion. They saw her as someone who existed for their pleasure. And when she died, they mourned the loss of the fantasy, not the person. This pattern didn't end with her death. In fact, it accelerated, because a dead celebrity is easier to commodify than a living one. A dead celebrity can't object to how they're portrayed, can't sue for defamation, can't say no to having their image used. Marilyn Monroe's estate has made hundreds of millions of dollars since her death. And where does that money go? Not to causes she cared about, not to supporting young actresses or funding mental health research. It goes to the people who own the rights to her image, the people who profit from her fame. And it's not just her estate. Countless books, films, and documentaries have been made about Marilyn, most of them without any new insight or information. They recycle the same stories, the same theories, the same footage, but they keep being made because Marilyn sells, tragedy sells, mystery sells. In 2022, Netflix released a fictionalized film about Marilyn's life, based on a novel that took significant creative liberties with the facts. The film was graphic, exploitative, and widely criticized, but it was watched by millions. Because people are drawn to Marilyn, not to understand her, but to consume her. And that's the real tragedy. Not that Marilyn Monroe died young, but that in death she became exactly what she spent her life trying not to be. An object, a commodity, a thing to be bought and sold and reshaped according to the needs of the market. There's a photograph of Marilyn that was taken in 1962, just a few months before she died. She's sitting alone on a bench looking off into the distance. Her face is unguarded. She's not performing, she's not smiling. She just looks tired, sad, human. That photograph rarely circulates. It's not the Marilyn people want to see. People want the glamour shots, the red lips, the white dress, the sultry smile. They want the fantasy, not the reality. And maybe that's the cruelest part of Marilyn's legacy. That we've taken a woman who desperately wanted to be seen as more than her appearance, and we've reduced her to an image. We've taken a woman who wanted to be respected for her mind, and we've turned her into a sex symbol in perpetuity. We say we admire her. We say she was ahead of her time. We say she was a feminist icon. But if that's true, why do we keep reducing her to her body? Why do we keep focusing on her relationships with men? Why do we keep treating her death as entertainment? The answer is uncomfortable. We do it because it's profitable. Because Marilyn Monroe, the myth, generates more money than Marilyn Monroe, the person, ever did. Because we've built an entire industry around her image. And that industry depends on keeping her frozen in time, forever young, forever tragic, forever consumable. But what if we stopped? What if instead of buying another Marilyn Monroe t-shirt or watching another exploitative documentary, we asked ourselves what she would have wanted? What if we remembered her as a person who struggled, who tried, who wanted more than what she was given? What if we acknowledged that Marilyn Monroe was a victim of a system that chewed her up and spit her out? That Hollywood exploited her? That the press harassed her? That the public consumed her without ever really seeing her? And that in death, we've continued to exploit her in ways that are arguably worse than anything that happened to her in life? Because at least when she was alive, she had some agency. She could say no. She could push back. She could try to shape her own narrative, even if she rarely succeeded. But now she's powerless. She can't stop us from using her image, can't stop us from telling her story in ways that serve our purposes rather than honoring her truth. There's a term in cultural criticism, necro-capitalism. It refers to the way that death becomes a site of profit. The way that dead bodies, dead celebrities, dead tragedies are turned into commodities. Marilyn Monroe is one of the most striking examples of this phenomenon. Her death didn't end her exploitation, it made it worse. And it's not just about the money, it's about the narratives we construct. Every time we tell Marilyn's story as a cautionary tale about fame, we're reinforcing the idea that women who seek success are doomed. Every time we focus on her relationships with men, we're erasing her ambitions, her intelligence, her agency. Every time we speculate about her death without acknowledging the systemic failures that led to it, the lack of mental health support, the predatory Hollywood system, the misogyny of her era, we're participating in the same erasure that defined her life. We're saying that what matters isn't the person, it's the story we want to tell. And the story we want to tell is always the same. Beautiful woman. Tragic end. It's a story that feels inevitable. That feels like a moral lesson. That feels, in a perverse way, satisfying. But it's not true. Marilyn Monroe's death wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific circumstances, specific failures, specific people who didn't do enough to help her. She didn't die because she was too beautiful or too famous or too ambitious. She died because she was struggling and the systems around her failed. And if we really wanted to honor her legacy, we would focus on that. We would talk about mental health, about addiction, about the ways that industries exploit vulnerable people. We would ask how we can prevent the next Marilyn Monroe, how we can build systems that protect people instead of destroying them. But that's not what we do. Instead, we buy the merchandise, we watch the documentaries, we perpetuate the myths. Because it's easier, because it's more comfortable, because facing the truth would require us to acknowledge our complicity. And make no mistake, we are complicit. Every time we consume Marilyn Monroe content without questioning it, we're participating in her commodification. Every time we reduce her to a sex symbol or a tragic figure, we're erasing the complexity of her humanity. Marilyn Monroe was more than her image. She was a person who read Dostoevsky and studied acting, and wanted children and struggled with insecurity and fought to be taken seriously. She was someone who tried, again and again, to escape the box she'd been put in. And she failed. Not because she wasn't smart enough or strong enough, but because the system was rigged against her. And now, 60 years after her death, we're still putting her in that same box. Still reducing her to an image. Still profiting from her pain. Still refusing to see her as a whole person. If there's one thing to take away from Marilyn Monroe's story, it's this. The way we remember someone matters. The narratives we construct, the images we circulate, the myths we perpetuate, all of it shapes how we understand not just that person, but ourselves. Marilyn Monroe's legacy tells us something about who we are, about what we value, about how we treat people, especially women who dare to be ambitious or vulnerable or both. It tells us that we're more interested in consumption than compassion, more interested in mythology than truth. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can choose to remember Marilyn differently, not as a product, not as a cautionary tale, but as a person who deserved better than what she got in life and better than what we've given her in death. We can choose to stop buying the merchandise, to stop watching the exploitative content, to stop participating in the industry that profits from her tragedy. We can choose to tell her story with honesty and complexity, to acknowledge her struggles without romanticizing them, to honor her ambitions without dismissing them. And maybe if we do that, Marilyn Monroe can finally rest. Not as an icon, not as a symbol, but as a person who lived, who tried, who suffered, and who deserved more than she ever received. Because in the end, that's what she was. A person. And that's what we've spent 60 years refusing to see. We've looked at her image so many times that we've forgotten there was a human being behind it. We've consumed her story so thoroughly that we've lost sight of the life that was actually lived. Marilyn Monroe died on August 5th, 1962. But in many ways, we've never let her die. We've kept her alive, frozen in time, forever 36, forever tragic, forever ours to consume. And that perhaps is the cruelest legacy of all. Not that she died young, but that we've never let her rest. But there's another dimension to this that deserves attention. Something that reveals even more about how we've transformed Marilyn into a cultural product rather than remembering her as a person. In recent years, there's been a shift in how Marilyn is discussed publicly. She's often claimed as a feminist icon, a woman who challenged Hollywood's sexism, who fought for equal pay, who refused to be just a pretty face. And there's truth in that. Marilyn did fight. She did push back. She did try to take control of her career in ways that were revolutionary for her time. But here's the problem. We're retrofitting her life to fit our current narratives. We're taking a woman who struggled and suffered and failed more often than she succeeded, and we're turning her into an empowerment symbol. We're using her image to sell modern feminism without acknowledging the ways that feminism failed her when she was alive. Where were the feminists in 1962 when Marilyn was fired from her last film? Where was the solidarity when she was being called difficult and unstable? Where was the movement that would protect women like her from exploitation, from harassment, from the predatory systems that destroyed her? It didn't exist yet, and Marilyn died before she could benefit from the changes that would come later. So when we claim her as a feminist icon now, we're not honoring her struggle, we're appropriating it. We're using her image to make ourselves feel better about how far we've come, without acknowledging that we left her behind. This is what cultural legacy does. It takes a complicated, painful, human story and smooths out all the rough edges. It turns a person into a symbol that can mean whatever we need it to mean in the moment. Marilyn becomes a feminist when we want to talk about empowerment. She becomes a victim when we want to talk about Hollywood's darkness. She becomes a cautionary tale when we want to warn young women about the dangers of fame. But she's never just allowed to be what she actually was. A woman who wanted to act, who wanted to be loved, who wanted to be taken seriously, and who died before any of those things could fully happen. The most telling aspect of Marilyn's posthumous fame is how little it resembles what she wanted for herself. She didn't want to be frozen at 36 forever. She didn't want to be remembered primarily for her appearance. She didn't want her personal struggles to become public entertainment. In her final interview, given to Life magazine just weeks before her death, Marilyn spoke about wanting to be remembered as someone who tried. She said she wanted people to know that she worked hard, that she cared about her craft, that she wasn't just the image they saw on screen. But that's not what happened. Instead, we remember the image. We remember the tragedy. We remember everything except what she actually wanted us to remember. And perhaps that's the final indignity. That Marilyn Monroe spent her life fighting to control her own narrative, and in death, she lost that fight completely. Her story is no longer hers. It belongs to us now, and we've shaped it into something that serves our needs, not her memory. So what do we owe her? If anything, maybe we owe her the truth. Not the comfortable myths, not the convenient narratives, but the complicated, uncomfortable reality of who she was and what happened to her. We owe her the acknowledgement that she was exploited, that Hollywood used her up and threw her away, that the public consumed her without caring about the cost, that we've continued that consumption for 60 years without pause or reflection. We owe her the recognition that she was more than her image, that behind the photographs and the films and the headlines, there was a person who thought and felt and struggled and hoped. A person who deserved compassion, not commodification. Support, not speculation. And maybe, just maybe, we owe her the dignity of letting her rest, of stopping the endless cycle of books and films and documentaries that claim to reveal the real Marilyn, while actually just perpetuating the same tired narratives. Because the real Marilyn Monroe died in 1962. And what we have now isn't her. It's a ghost, a projection, a product, something we've created to fill our own needs, to satisfy our own curiosity, to generate our own profit. And until we're willing to acknowledge that, until we're willing to stop consuming and start reflecting, Marilyn Monroe will never truly be at peace. She'll remain frozen in our cultural consciousness, forever 36, forever tragic, forever ours to use as we see fit. That's not a legacy. That's a haunting. And it says far more about us than it ever will about her.